Hi all, this is Dr. Kala S.J., an Associate Professor of English at Fatima College, Madurai, South India. And now we're going to deal with the essay My Home Under Imperial Fire by a noted writer Chinua Achebe. Chinua Achebe is a novelist, a poet, a critic, and a dominant figure of modern African literature. In this particular essay, he deals with his personal experiences even as a child. So he begins the essay saying that he has earliest memories of his childhood, particularly of his homecoming. And now when he talks about homecoming, he says it's extraordinary. Even to recollect about homecoming, it's really extraordinary, he says. And he's saying he's returning to his ancestral home for the first time. Isn't it ironical? You're returning home for the first time. So he's saying, okay, let us not be detained there, because he's got more engaging things to talk about that. So he begins saying that when he was just 5 years old, he started riding in a motor vehicle for the first time. And this was a kind of an experience that he had always looked forward to. But then he says something was not okay with the riding of the motor vehicle. You know why? Because he sat at the back of the truck. So when you sit at the back of the truck, what do? You face the wrong way. And that's what Chinua Achebe also did. He faced the wrong way. His vision was not in line with the motion of the vehicle. Rather, it was opposite that. So he was facing the wrong way, and he says he was seeing from where he was coming from instead of where they were going to. And not just that, dust, smell, or rather I should say stench and speed and roadside trees, all that really made him a little uncomfortable. Even as a child, when we travel, especially by trains in India, you must have noticed that as you travel, you find the trees and the buildings moving along. So here it moves along, but in the wrong direction, causing him a kind of a nausea, a kind of a fear, a dizziness, and all that. But then somehow he mustered all courage, I should say, to persevere with that voyage, or persevere with that travel, with that journey, and they finally halted at home in their hometown. And when they reached that, he says there was certain reason for this frightening journey. What was this reason? His own father, he was returning to his native land after how many years? After 30 years of his service as a missionary. And he had certain things to do. What had he done? He had founded or established a church newly in his own hometown. And at the same time, simultaneously, he had to take care of a fledgling church somewhere. And now he had earned two things. What are that? After 30 years of missionary life, he had earned the rest, and he had earned a pension of 30 shilling per month. Okay, so he was also very happy because he was taking his family back to his ancestral home. And how was this house? So Chinua Achebe goes on to describe the house that they had just landed. It was a grand house, a building that he had scraped to build, who the father had just struggled or put in all his efforts to build a grand house. And when did he really build this house? During the final years of evangelism. And you find that this particular house, okay, this particular house was a grand house. It had an iron roof, okay. It also had whitewashed earth. So earth probably out of mud. So that's the description of his home. Whitewashed earth. And then he tries to draw a contrast between the house that they lived earlier in the place where his father was working as a missionary and the house that they have just moved on to. So earlier it was a thatched roof house, and now excuse me, it had iron roof, so totally it was different. And he really tries to contrast these two. So I go on to describe Chinua Achebe's house that they have just moved into was a grand house with an iron roof. It had a whitewashed earth, and it was totally different from the house that they had just left, the mission house that they had just left, because it had thatch roof there, unlike the house that they have moved in. And now, so this is a homecoming, of course, but then it was homecoming only to their father, not to them, because they have never been here. I wouldn't say it was not a homecoming, but they had never been here before except for his father, who lived in this place called Ogidi, Ogidi, Ogidi. And he says all the others who have just visited this place Ogidi are new to it except his father. And his father had left Ogidi for the Anglican mission in the year 1904, and now you see it's 1935. Okay, and it's there's a long spell after which, as he rightly pointed out, after sort of 30 years they're coming back. Okay, so when they move in, it's 1935, and there's a long gap, and only father had been here in Ogidi before. Neither his mother nor the other siblings were there, including himself. So he starts giving us a detail of how his father got married to his mother, or when the father got married to his mother in the year 1909, especially 5 years after he became a missionary. And the mother had grown up in her own town, which was almost 20 odd miles away. So she had grown up there, and after returning to Ogidi, father had taken up a new mission. He has founded a church there. So he started preaching there. So he gave a homecoming sermon. Okay, being a preacher, he gives a homecoming sermon. And what happens, you find that he gives this particular sermon at a church called St. Philip's Anglican Church, and this church is one church that he had helped to establish. So now, as a child, Chinua Achebe says he doesn't remember what the father preached. He doesn't remember the sermon, but he is very clear about the consequences that they had to undergo. Okay, so the father had told about all that he had undergone as a missionary since he began his missionary life in the year 1904. So people started, like, everybody. So I think the father had every now and then referring to the year 1904. So the people around were taken up by the antiquity too. What do? His own schoolmates, they started, or others even, they started nicknaming their father as 1904. But then it was not an unambiguous encomium. Encomium, it's a praise. Okay, it's not an unambiguous encomium, says Chinua Achebe. So now, with this, you have Chinua Achebe perceiving Ogidi. So as a child, how does he look at Ogidi? He and his siblings were sent to school, and at school, all the boys started teasing them as 1904's children, 1904's children. And Chinua Achebe is very fair. He says, I don't disagree with this sobriquet. Sobriquet is the epithet sort of given to his father. So he says, I do not deny it. But he forms an idea of Ogidi. What are the two ideas that he forms about, or how does he perceive the people of Ogidi? He says, he as a child, he feels that the people of Ogidi are not very nice, and that the school was not a friendly place. So he did not like it at all. And not just that, he says that homecoming was not a wonderful thing to start with. It had not initiated so well. So now he goes on to talk about the people of the Igbo people. What is his opinion of the Igbo people? The Igbo people of southeast Nigeria were more than 10 million strong, he says. and they are one of the major peoples of Africa. Peoples, when I say, it refers to different races that you find in Africa. And so the Igbo people were conventionally called a tribe. Now, but then he differs, and he differs from what they are usually called. He says that they are normally called Igbo tribes, but then Chinua Achebe would like to call them a nation. And so before calling them a nation, he wants to describe, or he wants to define what a tribe is. So he says tribe, he gives us a definition of tribe as the group of families or communities linked by social, religious or blood ties, and usually having a common culture and dialect and a recognized leader. Okay, families or communities that are networked or linked by, what are they? Social, religious or blood ties, and they seem to be having a very common culture, okay, and a dialect also. Above all these things, they also had a recognized leader, he says, okay, a recognized leader. So he wonders how could this happen. And now what does he do? He goes on further to talk about the social and political identity. So he says how he doesn't accept the Igbos as a tribe. He says they are not primitive. They are not linked by blood as does the definition state. They do not speak one dialect, rather they speak one language. And they speak a language, so they do not speak on one dialect, but they speak the Igbo language. And he also tries to stress upon the fact that each of these Igbo languages, this Igbo language, not each of these Igbo languages, I'm sorry, this Igbo language has certain major and minor dialects. See, according to the definition, a tribe has a culture of its own or uses a dialect. But then here they don't use a dialect, rather they use a language. And then the Igbos lack a recognized leader. Okay, so this very fact that they don't have a recognized leader tells us about how they have a social, the social or political, it talks about their social and political identity, he says. Okay, so with this we go on to his next understanding or reference to the Igbo people as a nation. He says the Igbo people are a nation. Okay, now you find that there is a little bird that landed on an ant hill. Now this bird standing on an ant hill thinks that it's standing on a mountain and just looks at everything in from a bird's eye view, as we normally say. So he says it's not that way. But then his substantiation of Igbos as a nation is far better than the birds, he says. It is not an illusionary flight, he says. And so he goes on to define nation now. He says, according to the dictionary, a nation is a community of people. Who are they? Mainly of common descent, okay, history or a language, and they form a state or inhabiting a territory. They inhabit a particular territory. Maybe if you still want a better clarity, you can rewind and listen to this. So that's the definition of a nation. So now, though Igbos cannot be closely, perfectly related with the concept of nation, yes, yet they can be closely related with the concept of nation, unlike the tribe. So he says the terminology tribe would not define the Igbos in a better way. Rather, it's a term nation which would be a befitting description of the Igbos. So he says nation is not highly loaded with meaning, or it's not derogatory, but then he has certain reasons of why he calls the Igbos a nation. He says it's because of variety of forms, or in the due course he has because of things that have happened. Now he goes on to talk about how the Igbos were in the pre-colonial times. The Igbo nation, the pre-colonial times, were not like a nation. It's after that he's very clear. So before the colonial times, they were not exactly like Igbo nation. They were not like a nation. Why does he say so? Because he says they did not have a centralized government. But the Igbos were a conglomeration of thousands of independent towns or villages. Okay, so how were they operating? How were these towns and villages were operating individually, independently, and still were together considered as an Igbo nation? He comes to explain to that. Now you see this flow chart, you find a hierarchical chart, you find that there are hundreds of independent towns and villages. Okay, these towns and villages, they run their own affairs among themselves. So each town takes care of its own affairs. Right? Now you have the men folk taking care of their responsibilities, and the women folk looking into theirs. Now what do the men folk do? According to age and occupation, the men folk engage in various activities other than the activities that the women folk engage in. What do the women folk do? Women folk have domestic responsibilities, and they manage scores of 4-day market and 8-day market. Now this 4-day market and 8-day market stuff are totally in the purview of the women. Men don't indulge in it. Okay, now if I were to talk about that, that will again be a very intense and very deep topic, and I'll be digressing from this, so I stop here. Okay, so now that's how the towns and the villages, though they were independent, function. Look at the markets. What do you know about the markets? The markets were bound by the entire region and the neighborhood. So if there was a town, it just linked the town and also neighborhood. Now when I say the entire region, it means there was a network of daily exchange of two things: goods and news. Isn't it interesting to note that they also exchanged news in the marketplace? Yes, even now things happen in the same way here in South India. You have people talking a lot in the marketplace. Okay, so there also they used to be consciously doing, and that's how it went on. So now he talks about one particular town of Ogidi and how it was in 1935 when Chinua Achebe and his family returned. So Ogidi also, like the hundreds of towns that we had just looked into, was one of the hundreds of towns. And Ogidi cherished its individuality, it cherished its identity, but then in a generic way. So Ogidi as itself was a town of its own, it was independent, but then when you look at it in a generic way, when you can consider that the town and its people were perceived as Igbo people. Okay, so as I told you, though they were separate, though they have their own autonomy to function on their own, yet there was a kind of a cord that bound them all together, and that's the Igbo-ness. This Igbo-ness was a vague identity, and this Igbo-ness was put to use frequently whenever there was a need for it, or whenever a need arose for it. Okay, and they enjoyed their sovereign authority in 800 or so villages, the Igbos. And now there is a proverb describing their political attitude also sometimes. Now coming on to competitions, we know that though they were linked up, though these 800 odd towns or hundreds of towns and villages were linked up together with Igbo-ness, there was always a kind of competition among them. And this competition was among these communities. there was a strong feature of Igbo life, which you can see was present more in which was more obvious or prevalent in the colonial times than to the present. Okay, so that might have led to conflicts. So when there were competitions, it might have certainly led to conflicts, but there were certain compelling reasons. See, as I told you, these Igbo towns were independent, and one town vied with another, and they competed with one another. There were conflicting situations. Okay, so this Igbo life, the strong feature of Igbo life, you can see, or it was evident in the colonial times than it is evident in the present. But then there were conflicting moments, I told you. Besides the conflicting moments, there were moments when they also came together. So there were compelling reasons for two things. What were the compelling reasons for two things? Peace and cooperation. So I told you, beyond all these things, there was this Igbo-ness that was running in their blood, that was in their veins. So that brought them together, and whenever they felt that they ought to have peace and cooperation, it was put into practice. So now you see the vital regional institutions. What is it? There are so many things. One is the network of markets. So that brought them all together under the umbrella of Igbos. Then the rights and obligations of, what were the rights and obligations? Cross-communal what? Marriages and funerals, sometimes that took place. So whenever they came together from one town to another, or from one tribe to another, that was a kind of a binding factor. So cross-communal marriages and cross-communal funerals. Then, so first one was network of markets. Second was rights and obligations of cross-communal marriages and funerals. Then you have, now and then, they consciously engaged in dissemination of two things. What were they? Songs and dances that they were very, very fond of, or that was part of their identity, native identity, indigenous identities. And so what did they do with that? They disseminated it. They transmitted it to their posterity. They transmitted it to people who never knew it. So one tribe learned these songs and dances from other tribe, which was ephemeral. And then sometimes the certain dances and songs were very temporal. Okay, some of them which were really appealing, those songs and dances lasted through a couple of seasons. Okay, so seasons, I said, some would last for a season. So if they lasted for a season, that itself was something amazing. But then something more surprising was certain songs and dances, they lasted for a few years, and that was something that would be passed on to the generation, and there was a kind of a musical explosion also. Okay, so besides these, they also felt that there was this role of host and mentors which was also passed on. Okay, so as I told you earlier, when these musical explosions occurred, they returned to Ogidi, and when they returned to Ogidi, they found that there was something called this Egwu Obi. What is this Egwu Obi? This Egwu Obi this is a kind of a music that lasted for more than a few years, and that reached Ogidi also. This Egwu Obi was called the Song of the Heart, and you know, this was so very mesmerizing that it even tried to seduce the Europeans, and so it stayed for more than a decade. And gradually this Egwu Obi started being nicknamed Egwu Tochi, meaning song of the torchlight. Okay, now where did these songs originate from? There are rumors that it originated from a place called Nizam. And what is this Nizam bought? This Nizam was a fertile land, and it was an easygoing land. It was a land along the floodplains of Anambana River, And this particular, there are rumors that this song might have evolved or originated especially when the harvests were done. So soon after the harvest, there was flooding also. There must have been flooding also. What happens when there is a flood? You have lots of alluvial soils coming up with all its mineral richness, natural richness, and so it becomes good for the next season of farming. So there is a rumor that this particular song must have originated during soon after the harvest and during the flooding. So soon after the flooding, what happened? There was a renewal of the soil of the farmland. Okay, so that's to do with the origin of this song. But then, whom did they learn from? There is a say, the people believe that this song, they must have learnt it from the birds. What does it talk about? It talks about how these people were very closely associated with nature. Okay, so they seem to have learned it from the birds. Now, gradually you find Chinua Achebe being little closer with his hometown Ogidi. Remember how he felt soon after coming? He felt the people of Ogidi were not good, school was not okay, and all that. But now he started turning a little sentimental towards Ogidi, and so he says that it is not that the emotions grew up gradually, instantly, that the emotion exploded instantly, but then it started growing up gradually, which evolved into a lifelong quest. Okay, so now he goes on to say that he really started liking Ogidi. And what do you find? You find that he starts describing about the grand house. So we get a new picture about a new picture of the grand house. What is the picture of grand house that you get? He starts telling us about the piazza. He says there is a front room in the house where his father received, that F stands for the father, where his father received the visitors. And this piazza is a missionary usage. And the father had a younger half brother. This younger half brother, the father couldn't try to convert him into Christianity, and the father realized that it was a failure also. And because of this, probably the relationship between his father and his own brother, rather Achebe's uncle, had turned cold. Now, but then he says brother was still a brother. So what happened? What really happened? The brother, soon after the construction of this zinc house or the grand house, he moved into this house to take care of it before father's retirement. And now, so before the father could come here, settle down in 1935 in Ogidi, the father had constructed the house and someone had to stay there till the family shifted here. So what did the brother do? Soon after going there, entering the house, he installed heathen shrines of Ikenga. So it was against Christianity. He installed heathen shrine of Ikenga, and also other household divinities. He thought that Chinua Achebe says that he thought that the father would mildly disapprove it, but then the brother also thought so, but the brother was totally mistaken, because the father was really, really furious about it. He was so furious that he demanded immediate removal of the shrine from the house, not just the house, even from the compound. And maybe because of this, there was a kind of a strife between the father and his brother. And Achebe thinks that must be the real cause of the coolness or the Cold War between the father and his brother. But then Achebe didn't have the courage to ask his father. However, he asked his father if the father had reconsecrated the house after the brief tenancy and desecration of his brother. Why do I say desecration? See, the Chinua Achebe's father was a Christian, and so he had consecrated his house with all Christian prayers. Now, the brother had brought in, according to their beliefs, the brother had brought in a heathen god. So Achebe wonders if the father had really reconsecrated it, because the brother had desecrated it. Okay, but then somehow whenever the father thinks about this incident, there is a kind of a indulgent smile, and he says, when he gives that smile, he's kind of a gallow human. Okay, what is that, what makes him smile that way, give an ironical smile? Probably it's because the father feels that he could convert so many people into Christianity, but he failed it in his own hometown, in his own family, and that he couldn't do good things about it with regard to his brother, half brother. So even that, so he says, the brother was still into Satan, like he was not able to convince his brother to throw away the Satan, and he says probably his half brother was in the form of a Satan, and he's saying, see, Satan was working in his own house, behind him, where in the very front room of his house. Okay, so from that he understands that both of his parents were strong and uncompromising in their Christian belief, but they were not fanatical. Okay, their lives were ruled as much by reason, so they were reasonable, and their lives were governed by reason, and their lives were also governed by faith. They had common sense, they were compassionate by doctrine, and Chinua Achebe goes on to say that the people or the readers shouldn't be surprised that the brother was a heathen, and he's saying it's not the brother was the only heathen in the family, there were others also. Actually, in fact, he was just a part of the majority of the heathens in the family. And then he goes on to say about how father always received his friends and peers and relatives in Piazzo, and whether they were Christian or not, he used to be sitting with them, spending time with them, chatting. He would even share cola nut and palm wine and all that with the friends whom he used to be entertaining. And then when he used to be entertaining them, father used to be entertaining them in Piazza, and the mother would be receiving her visitors in the parlor. Look at it, a kind of boundary demarcation. Father in Piazza and mother in the parlor. And then there would be conversations and disagreements among themselves going on both simultaneously sometimes, or separately, even in Piazza as well as in the parlor. And he says most often the conversations and disagreements that took place in Piazza have influenced Chinua Achebe a lot in understanding, in gaining knowledge about African history and African culture, or if I have to say, Igbo history and Igbo culture. Okay, so now he goes on to talk about, so from that he starts sharing of what he has just understood. He says, one of Ogidi's neighboring towns, earlier on they decided to migrate to Ogidi town, long time ago, he says. And so when they did not they were not happy with the place that they were staying on the neighboring town, so they requested the people of Ogidi that they would like to settle down. Okay, so Chinua Achebe says those were the days when there were lots of lands around, and so people always welcomed the others to come into their town. But then, so first request was that they should be given place in Ogidi. So the Ogidi people also accepted. They were so welcoming. They accepted strangers, or strangers, because they were not people of Ogidi. They come in, they welcome the newcomers. After that, these newcomers had a second request. What was that second surprising request? They wanted to know how to worship the gods of Ogidi. Surprising, isn't it? So they asked them, how do we worship the gods of Ogidi? Now, naturally, we would ask this question, what happened to your god? What did you do with your gods? But the Ogidi people wondered about it, but they didn't ask them about it, because they know that when a person comes to you asking for a god, that certainly must be telling of what a terrible story they have, or what a terrible story they must have to ask for gods. So they did not decide, so they did not want to pry into their personal reasons. They did not want to pry into or look into or probe into why they wanted gods. So they gave. Now they were very generous. Ogidi people, they gave the land. They gave them place to settle down there. Now they gave them two of Ogidi gods. Who are the two Ogidi gods? Udo and Ogwugwu. Okay, Udo and Ogwugwu. Now they were very clear. Okay, we give you our gods, but then listen, let us have a deal. Let us have an understanding. What's that understanding? You newcomers will always pray to Udo's sons and not Udo. They keep there's a hierarchy there. So they are generous enough to give away their gods, but they're very particular that they should not be worshipping to Udo, but they should be worshipping only to Udo's sons. Likewise, they should not be worshipping Ogwugwu, but they should be calling only the daughter, so that there is no confusion later on with regard to the rituals and ceremonies that they have during the worship of these deities. Okay, so now he comes on to a local lore about this local lore of how newcomers came and settled down in Ogidi. So he wants to highlight on this fact that there is a possibility of internal migration in the Igbo land. So this is where he talks about this Igbo-ness. So Igbo people migrate from one town to another, and they migrated to Ogidi a long time ago, but then it has now by now turned into part of history and part of mythology. Okay, so now but then there is nobody has ever summoned a court talking about boundary litigations between the two towns and all that. They have beautifully settled down and they know how to respect one another. And now it is at this time that Chinua Achebe says that there has been a profound significance that has dawned on him. The Igbo town is not it gives away its deities. The Ogidi people, they gave away their deities, but they were very particular that there shouldn't be any confusion. They demarcate saying you should be worshipping the son and the daughter instead of the adult gods. Okay, so now the reluctance of an Igbo town to foist, so it was not welcome. So foist means not an unwelcoming act. So they had the reluctance of an Igbo town to foist what its religious beliefs and practices, but then when they are asked to do it, they have a different way of doing it. But Chinua Achebe says, I'm sure they were not so sharp enough to know about the psychology of religious imperialism that's going to come into their lives very soon. That part he feels that the Igbos were very innocent, because mainly during the colonial times, the colonizers tried to convert them into Christianity, and that's what he calls religious imperialism. And he says, so they now when newcomers came to their land, they were very particular about whom to worship, whom not to. Okay, but then they were not very exposed to or very prepared to face the religious imperialism that came in the form of European evangelism. Okay, so now they never even thought that there would be some sort of strangers who would sail almost thousands of miles away and tell them that they were worshipping false gods, and that they have to worship another God who was a living God. So when these strangers talked to them about it, they were amazed with open mouth, and that amazement, that surprise, that innocence, that gullible nature of these people was the core factor behind their conversion. But then his parents, he says, they were level-headed, and that was the result of that good fortune. Okay, what was the good fortune of being converted? Now he says that though he was sent to school, he had his informal education also. One or two more examples of informal education guarded. One is, earlier we know that he got to know about his own history, his own culture, mostly from the conversations and disagreements that took place in piazza and the parlor with among his father's friends and among his mother's friends. But then he was very sharp enough to say that most of his observations were based upon what his father and his friends spoke. So his informal education he had garnered in the garnered from the father's friend room, or what's it called, piazza. That's a missionary term, father's friend room. And similarly, from other similar settings in my childhood, he says. Then he goes on to tell us about what he has learned about his ancestors. The first ancestor of Ugidi people. See, according to the Bible, Adam and Eve were created by God, and thereafter the others came into this world. Then here the creation myth or the creation story of the Ogidi people is totally different and amazing. How is it different? The first ancestor of the Ogidi people was named Chuamaga. Chuamaga. Okay, so he has a name. And then who created him? He was created by Chukwu. Where was he created? In the present site of the town, that's Ogidi. Okay. Thereafter, what did Chukwu do? Chukwu moved to a certain distance and he planted another early man, and he created a command called Ezumaka. It's not the word created, rather it's the word planted. Okay. Now, this Ezumaka was the father of the neighboring Nekwil people. Now there was a boundary also, a geographical boundary created, a natural boundary created. Who created it? Chukwu created. How did he create? He created the river named Ksi, and that flowed between them, between Ezumaka's place, okay, and the earlier first man's place. So now it moved, the river moved. Then, so this is something about the Igbo people, a folklore about the Igbo people. And it's not just about one person, it's also about the individuals and the creation of individual towns. So these folklores highlight upon how separate and individual towns were created. Not just that, these creation myths also underline how every single human being, or how each of the human beings are very unique, special. Okay, so each of them, each single human being is considered to be a unique creation of Chi. Who is this Chi? Chi is Chukwu's agent. Okay, now this Chi, for each individual there was a Chi, like the guardian angel. So they don't use the word guardian angel, but in Chi you find God. So there was presence of God in Chi, and this Chi attended on every human being. So each human being had a Chi. So now what's the creation myth trying to stress upon, or what does Chinua Achebe want to tell us about this creation myth? He says that each individual is very important, and so it's not that there are the deities, and then the deities are worshipped and the individuals are not given importance to. Each individual human being is associated with a deity, and so what is more stressed upon? It's the Igbo individuality. And Chinua Achebe says in his essay that he will talk about that a little later, and then he is a kind of a proportion about the community. So now he goes to tell us about a charming little Igbo story. What is that? Long ago, all the animals had a meeting. So they were summoned by the town crier. You know, they come and announce, and they said that there's a meeting tomorrow at such and such a place, and all the animals are requested to come. It's an ad hoc meeting, an urgent meeting, and all are supposed to be there. So now this folklore is shared to tell us about how each of them had the power to speak. Okay, so now all the animals go. The chicken is also running. But the chicken is not going towards the meeting spot, rather it's digressing from the meeting spot. So one animal stops the chicken and asks, "Where are you running? Don't you remember that there's going to be a meeting?" At this, the chicken says, "Oh yeah, I know, but then I have some personal things to look into. I have to attend to an important personal matter. So, do me a favor. Please go and give away my good wishes to all who have assembled in the meeting." See, respecting others. Okay, give my good wishes to all those who have assembled in the meeting. Second, declare, tell them that I would like to declare to support and abide by any resolution that's taken by the people there. So see, that's very important. They know to value others and the resolutions taken by a group of people. Now, what was the meeting about? It was an emergency meeting. Why did they have it? They suddenly have come to know or come to realize that the human beings were harassing them very rampantly. And so they were offering blood sacrifices to their deities, to their gods. And now this issue was brought up in the meeting, and in the meeting they had decided to they had to come to a consensus on whom they would offer as a sacrifice. Now remember, the chicken, in its hurry to attend it to its personal matter, had declared to support and abide by the resolution of the members who have gathered in the meeting. So they all decide that the chicken would be offered as a sacrificial animal. Okay, so what do you get to know about this story? You get to know about the world view of Igbo. What is it? Any individual or all individuals are unique. A town is unique. And when a town is unique, when individuals are unique, there are certain to be too many conflicts. Now, when there are conflicts or competing claims, how are these going to be resolved? So whenever there are any issues, there are popular assemblies. So they come there, they discuss. And even if it's small enough, all of them come there, assemble, and all of them speak their own mouth. That's to say, all of them get their chance to speak what they want. Okay, so now this is a fable of the negligent chicken, but then it's treasured, it's fable. You know, it's an assembly of his fellows, but then they are very serious about the Democrats. They don't want to be ruled by any king. Igbos do not want a leader, as we saw earlier. They do not wish to have a king. So they did not keep it as a secret even. In fact, some even, they did not like kings. They did not want a leader. And this fact was not a secret also. It was publicized to the extent that some would even name their sons Ezebrillo. Ezebrillo means a king is an enemy. My God, that's shocking, isn't it? So, Achebe says, just imagine a society where a man raises his voice against a king. And what does he say? He even has the cheek to say, a king is an enemy. And get me some cold water to drink, will you? So even he can even go to the extent of commanding a king. So Chinua Achebe tries to assert the individuality of the Igbos. I'm sorry about the spelling of the Igbos. Okay, so now the Igbos are not the product of some ongoing generic creativity. Please understand that. Cherry, something happened, so they're all there as a mass production. No, they are not. Rather, they are particular once and for all, a divine activity. So it's a divine activity, and so they realize that they are on the road of something called unique. So uniqueness is always attributed to the Igbos. Then what do they normally value? What do the Igbo people really respect? What do they normally value? They normally consider individual freedom as well as the virtual impossibility of its practical realization in society. They pay attention to individual freedom. At the same time, they know that when it has to be practically realized in society, that's highly impossible. They are aware of it. They are very, very clear about it. Okay, so now this self-consciousness, this self-awareness, see, in the name of individual freedom, they don't intervene with others' personal affairs. Okay, so this leads them to give the individual an importance. This leads them to consider individual unique. So, in the creation stories, the stories of Igbo people, we understand that the African people have lots of folklores. So, in their stories or in their creation stories, who becomes the hero? It's the individual. Okay, so they have a head start in the creation stories, and so they are able to keep their hold their head, excuse me, hold their heads up and declare. But then they also understand that no man should enter his house through another man's gate. That is to say, you should not pass through another man's freedom. You should not affect his freedom in the name of your freedom. So you have to respect the other's freedom also. Individuals have their freedom when provided they respect others' freedoms. So he goes on to talk about hundreds of autonomous Igbo villages and towns, which were all the time too very suspicious about political amalgamation. See, whenever political leaders wanted to bring up towns and villages, they were not happy. Okay, so naturally, what would they immediately do? They would go back to their histories, they would go back to their creation myths and draw motivations and inspirations from them. Now, they always felt the threat of anarchy, chaos. Okay, chaos. And but then sometimes they even preferred that, especially when when they knew that their whole nation was being devastated because of this Atlantic slave trade. Now, earlier on, the Atlantic slave trade was along the coasts, sea coast, but then now it started touching the mainlands too. Now, what do you know about the Igbos? Chinua Achebe says the Igbos always lived in a world of continual struggle, continual motion. Why? They had to move from one place to another, escaping from those people who would just rob away their freedom and take them as slaves. So these Igbos lived in a world of continual struggle, motion and change, and all that they underwent always got manifested in their art. Now, Igbo world, now because of all these tough times that they have in their lives, they were not easygoing people. When you go see them in their homeland, you will find that when you meet Igbos abroad or when you meet Igbos through literature, you will find that these Igbos were very tense people, or these Igbos were people with cocky temperament and all that, to the extent that the British always called them argumentative. Chinua Achebe goes on to say that in his first novel, which appeared in 1958, which had an elusive title, Things Fall Apart, it was observed and reviewed in a London Sunday paper by a highly critical reviewer who was offended. Okay, and what did she have to say? She just said, "Hooray to mere anarchy." Okay, because these people were happy about having an anarchy. So she just says, but then she did not know that these people also had this cosmological fear of anarchy, and she knew this was reflected in the novels of W.B. Yeats also, which Yeats knew intuitively. Now this reviewer says anarchy meant, what did anarchy mean to them? British Imperial rule. So this British Imperial rule was always under attack somewhere, some corner of the empire, and this reviewer says that this was an ungrateful upstart of a native, but then she failed to hear in it the resonance of an immemorial anxiety. There was a kind of an anxiety all over. So far he was talking to us about his informal education. Now probably he's focusing on his formal education. He had it in his quiet education in his hometown. So this hometown embodied him, kind of education that he had in his schools had deliberately left an impression of the formal education that he received at different places. What are they? At school, Sunday school, and in church. So he received, see, informal education, he had it at piazza and and the parlor, and also at other places when he was observing elders talking. Formal education, he had it in three places: the school, the Sunday school, and in church. Okay. So now, with regard to education, he says he's always experienced only formal education, only foreign aspects of the upbringing, and there was nothing Igbo about it. It was all to do with something beyond Igbo people, beyond Igbo places and all that. So they were all far away from it. And then he says later on, when he thinks about it, he feels that this acquisition of knowledge far away from Igbo people and places was painful. Why is it painful? He's an Igbo and he should be learning about Igbo places and Igbo people. Rather, he learned about foreign places and foreign people, which was painful. So now, but then he says, Igbo things did not vanish from me. They were still there with me. But then I always took them for granted, or sometimes they were unacknowledged, he says. So he says, he talks about how the atmosphere in the school also was. It was tense. Whenever he went to school, if he didn't do his work or if he was not good, though he was a good student, they would always receive a stroke or two from the teacher then, unlike the present scenario where a teacher is blamed for hitting the child. But then the teacher would hit the children. And then he says, even if he was good, he received it one day. And he said, greatest sufferers were those who didn't study well. So one day he had it, the teacher had hit him on his head so hard that he had a painful swelling. And so when he came and reported home, a typical father, he walks the child back home, and there he goes and talks to the teacher in a very displeased, and expresses his displeasure, and even remonstrates the teacher also. And this was quite shocking to Achebe, he says. Then gradually he got adjusted to the ways of life. What did he start doing? He started enjoying what? Reading and English composition. Okay, so now this led him, he was at board in school. So he was, as a teenage, he was in school. And so what did he do? He was exposed to many treasures, such as reading Treasure and other classical works, which you can read in the essay. Okay, now he goes on to glorify how the school had a wonderful library, and according to certain norms of the school, he was forced to read. So he was fascinated by the foreign stories that he was reading, because those stories were totally different from the stories that he had heard at home. So he was really very happy. Then he says, after school probably he took a false step. What was it? He enrolled as a student of medicine, but then after a year of after an academic year, he felt that he was not happy with it, and so he switched over to the faculty of arts. And he had dozens of reasons for it. One was superstitious belief. The other was he was trying to leave the realm of stories. He wanted to abandon stories and go into medicine, but the stories didn't leave him, Okay, then he goes on to explain the University College at Abadam. He says it was opened in November 1948, and it was a new experiment in higher education and all that. And this was towards the end of the British colonial rule in West Africa, and very surprisingly, but not surprisingly to all the colonies, because that's what we've all read, the syllabus and degrees were modeled on and supervised by London University, naturally, because it's their education. And who were the professors? That the professors were not Igbo professors, but they were British professors, and they taught in English. So they were from Europe, they were British, and they were from European universities, with just one or two exceptions. and they taught, with one or two exceptions, they taught the same authors like Shakespeare, Milton, Defoe, Swift, Wordsworth. Please excuse me for the spellings of Defoe and Swift. Okay, so Wordsworth and all that. And very recently, they felt that they were doing something good about by introducing an Anglo-Irishman's work, Joyce Carey. Joyce Carey was an Anglo-Irish. So he had written a recent Nigerian novel. What do I mean by Nigerian novel? A novel with a setting of Nigeria. Are you with me? Okay. So Joyce Carey was not a Nigerian. He was an English Irishman, and he had recently written a novel, a Nigerian novel, a novel with a setting or background of Nigeria. And it was titled Mr. Johnson. And this was really appreciated in England, and it was also appreciated in the Time magazine in America. Okay. And what did the Time magazine say? It said that it was the best novel ever written about Africa. So these English professors thought that they were doing good by introducing an outstanding novel that was written about a place and people that these children were familiar with, and they thought they would really appreciate it, but it did not go the way they expected it to happen, or they wanted to go on. One day, one of his classmates, Chinua Achebe's classmates, he got up and he told, I enjoy, of the whole book, the one event that I enjoyed was the Nigerian hero Johnson. He was shot to death by the British master, Mr. Rudbeck. Okay. Now, what's so good about it? Because he felt that instead of suffering, it's good that Johnson died in the hands of the British master. Now, when a boy gets up and talks about such a thing in a class to an English teacher, to an English professor, about an English man, what do you think would have happened? The other students also joined in the medley of noises, and they also started reacting. Chinua Achebe comes there to just chip in and says, to give us his observation. He says his judgment, his colleagues and the rest, the way they told maybe was not okay. They still had to learn, but they expressed their adverse literary opinion. Okay, beyond all that, the colleagues' anger at the idiot of a character created by Joyce Carey. He says that was an idiot of a character. Why did Carey create such a stupid character, they say. Now, the teacher was trying to pass on or glorify Joyce Carey for being so concerned, for giving them a graphic detail about Nigeria and all that. But then that was not true. So he's saying this incident was just beyond something very interesting because it happened in a colonial classroom and it was a kind of landmark rebellion. He says the whole class had young Nigerian students, and he also pats his own back saying probably the brightest of their generation. So these people, they united in their views to just shun that book of English fiction. Okay, so there was a kind of a complete opposition to the English teacher also. And now you understand, the English teacher has a good support. It was backed by the metropolitan critical judgment and all that. Now, the issue was not who was right. The issue was not to do with who was right. But then the issue was about the absolute divide between the Nigerians and the Englishmen. Okay, so the Nigerians, please excuse me about the spelling mistake there. The young or old, they all joined together unanimously, and that was the time of the independence from the British rule also, when they were thinking about it. So now the problem with Joyce Carey's book was not just the infuriating principal character Johnson, but it was the way Johnson was projected, the way the narrative movements went on. Not just the narrative movements, there when you read the novel, you will find out how the author had come up with his hatred for the place and the people. How there was a contagious distaste. Contagious, why do I say contagious? the Englishman did not like, and that dislike he was passing on to other people also, so it was contagious. A contagious passing of disdain, hatred, and mockery. So this had poisoned the tale, and so the boy got up to say, what a smart boy, no? What a brave fellow he must have been. He got up to say, the only thing that I enjoyed in this novel was the place where the English master kills his slave Johnson. So now there was an innocent party given by Johnson in the novel, and this was encountered. This is kind of a similar. You find a similarity in the Heart of Darkness also, where he talks about the Congress. So Carey writes about his home Nigeria. Whose home Nigeria? Carey is an Anglo-Irishman. Joyce Carey is an Anglo-Irishman. But what is he writing about? He is writing about Nigeria. Nigeria is the hometown of Chinua Achebe. Nigeria is the hometown of all the Nigerians. But then how can a foreigner write about their hometown? So they begin to understand. They understand that there is an absolute power over narrative. So now they understand that whoever has this power to narrate stories, are you with me? You understand? So whoever has the power to narrate stories can arrange and manipulate the stories they want to. So he compares this power of narration to that of a totalitarian regime. I repeat, he compares this power of narration or power over narrative techniques to the totalitarian regime. He says, whoever exercises power over the other can do anything that he wants to, or they can tarnish their image. Okay, so in Nigeria there was something called renting a crowd. So probably Carey also rented a crowd in his novel. And he observes that Carey had a strong aversion or hatred towards the people whom he was presenting, the people about him whom he was narrating. So what happens? The towns and villages where these people live are examples, as everyone knows, sensational writing about. So he started writing in a sensational way about Africa and Africans. So now, normally we get to know that this happens. Europeans normally do, because Conrad's yelling crowds also did the same. So where does this come from? Why does Carey think so? Why does Conrad also think so? What's the difference between these, or what's the similarity between these? So Achebe comes to an understanding that this has happened not because Joyce Carey had experienced something, but this has happened because there is some aspect of it called hand me down. So somebody has experienced something which has been handed over to him presently. So now he goes upon to stress on the British writing by Dorothy Hammond and Alter Jablow. He says that they published a study of British writing about sub-Saharan Africa for how many years? For over a period of 400 years. From which century to which century? From the 16th to the 20th centuries. So these two people have analyzed almost 500 volumes of fiction and non-fiction, and they titled their book The Africa That Never Was. How ironical. So what they have pictured was not the Africa. So it was totally a new Africa. So how they had tried to, the Britishers had tried to project a body of fantasy and myth about Africa. I repeat, it's not Africa in reality, but it's Africa in fantasy and a mythical Africa that these British writers tried to project in their writings. They didn't stop with that. They developed a kind of a tradition. Okay? And this tradition, they had very, very vivid and loud images. Okay? Loud images of Africa being brutal, Africa being barbaric in all its, whatever it is, all negative impressions. And these images, they didn't stop with just portraying them, but they visited again and again. That's what it is meant by hand me down. How long did they visit again and again? For almost centuries. Okay, and they drew material for their books from it. It was kind of a repository from which they drew materials for their future writings also. So now there is an account of the voyage to West Africa in 1561. Is written by the English ship captain John Locke, who gives us a taste of this writing at the early stages of the tradition. Which writing? Giving a projecting an Africa which is not real, but an Africa that is that is part of their fantasy and part of their myth. So they created a tradition, I said. That tradition they tried to project, John Locke tried to project in his book titled, in his book Voyage to West Africa. Okay, and this book was written in the early stages of the tradition, and he views Negroes in a different way. So now, what kind of writing is this? Why did the Europeans really try to imagine such things? Why did they want, for centuries till now, they talk about the Africans that way? So Achebe actually delivered this piece of essay as a lecture. So he's saying, I'm digressing from the purpose of my lecture. But he says, a tradition does not thrive on its own unless there's a need for it. There should be some reason why they created this tradition. So what is that reason? In 1560s, the English captain John Hawkins sailed to excuse me. In 1560s, English captain John Hawkins sailed to West Africa, and he tried to, that was when he possessed 300 Negroes. How did he do that? Through his sword, that is to say through violence or through other means. And meanwhile, or so long, the Britishers were trading with West Africans with different commodities. But for the first time, the other commodities were displaced or with the slaves. So by 1700s, the Britishers started trading in Africa, and their focus started shifting on trading the slaves. So Basil Davidson says, men in Europe were accustomed to seeing Africans, please note, were accustomed to seeing Africans only as men in chains, captives without power, and they transferred their impressions to Africa and the states from which these slaves had come. The belief in African inferiority was already in full bloom. So they considered the other as uncivilized and barbaric. Okay, so by the 18th century, more and more Europeans started habituating this thought. Europeans, I'm sorry about the spelling. Habituating this thought of what? Seeing the Africans as men in chains. And so they made tailor-made literature talking about the negativity of the Africans. So Hammond and Jobloff, in their analysis, indicate how British authors adjusted to suit their timings. Okay, so it was a blessing, not even a blessing in disguise, but a blessing that is clearly recognizable, he's saying. See, what is a blessing? Enslavement. Chinua Achebe says enslavement is a blessing. It's not even a blessing in disguise, but a blessing that's clearly recognizable. A blessing that is delivered, that's clearly recognizable. A blessing that is delivered and that has delivered them from so many other enslavements, he's saying. What are they? So, just a minute. Okay, so that delivered the poor wretches from a worse fate in their homeland. So had they been in their homeland, they would have been totally into all sorts of all sorts of negativity. They wouldn't have even come across come across the kind of luxury, the religion that they are experiencing right now. Chinua Achebe says probably. Okay, so now this literature, this tradition that these British writers have created, it served in the new historical era of European exploration of Africa. So Joyce Carey followed the first. He was working. He was in the first. He took part in the First World War, and then thereafter he was shifted to Nigeria, where he started serving reluctantly in the British Empire. And he was asked to serve in one corner of the British colony, which he really hated the job. So how did he wreak vengeance on himself and on the task assigned to him? He did that by writing the book titled Mr. Johnson. And therefore, he spewed all his hatred into the book. And beyond all these things, the book was introduced in the Nigerian University in 1952 to BA degree students of BA degree offered by the London University. So he's saying, I disagree strongly with an English teacher over an English book. And he's saying his classmates, none of them then in 1952 knew the historical antecedents of the book. They didn't, because they read a little about the African novels. They had never read much about it, the others. But our writer, Chinua Achebe, had read a lot about Rider Haggard, John Buchan, and therefore, but then when he was reading them, he could hardly connect himself with the characters or with his homeland. And Chinua Achebe himself says that was probably because I was too young then, or because I did not know how to fit it into it with all the foreign education that I had. Then he goes on to talk about the year 1952. He says the year 1952 was going to be a little different. How is it going to be different? Mr. Johnson was set in Nigeria. Mr. Johnson is a novel written by Joyce Carey. It was set in Nigeria. And it handled the concept of Nigeria with such familiarity and confidence. Okay, so all that was there. It was just the right time. Why? Why when the boy spoke up, when he stood up and told in the class that the best event that he liked in the book was where the master killed his slave Johnson. Why was it called the right time? Because in 1957, the sister colony of the Gold Coast became the independent state of Ghana. And slowly, the waves of independence was coming in, and there was this whirlwind of decolonization of Africa taking place. So they were all caught in that whirlwind, and there was excitement about the change that was already in the air. Okay, so now there were also at the same time some whites who did not believe in self-rule, and these people were very smart enough to call such whites as the imperialist. And like that, there was a senior professor at Ibadan. He had left India. He was just chased from India or forced to leave India because of its independence in 1947, and therefore he had fled to Nigeria. Now this person looks at another rebel which he had already faced in India. So this was not the first time that he is encountering such a thing. It was a second experience. So it was second dethronement. And so he was not affected by it. He was unamused by all that was happening. Now, what was the perspective of the people there? Quite naturally, they wanted to get rid of the white rule, but then they did not want to demonize the white people. They knew that hundreds of years they have sustained denigration. They were ignorant of it, and that they and their nation were subjected to all such humiliation for 100 years, and these people were ignorant of it. But in 1952, when he was in that class, at that time, when Joyce Carey's Mr. Johnson was taught, and when a boy got up and told about this incident that he really appreciated, at that time, if he were asked to consider who Joyce Carey was, he would have certainly told that he was an imperialist. So now he starts questioning his childhood assumption of innocence of stories, and suddenly it dawned on him that although fiction, it's story, it's from our imagination. So he says he's stressing upon that word. Although fiction, although the world created in it is fictitious, yet even fiction, even stories that come out of imagination could be true or false. How could they be true or false? With regard to two things. What are the two things? Intention, what they want to communicate, what is their intention, and integrity. Integrity, how you convey a matter with all its honesty. So he understood that. So I repeat, so it dawned on him that even if it's fiction, it has its own amount of truth or false. Then how did he understand this? He grasped this through the experience of life, whatever he experienced in his own hometown, so that, as well as his experience of reading. So rather, we'll put it this way: his informal education of watching, observing his elders and all the rituals and ceremonies around, and his reading of so many books. So he grasped all these things. When I say reading, he read them with scrutiny, and sometimes he revisited the books that he read as a child. So he started rereading the books that he read as a child. Why? Because now he had an adult's gaze, adult's perception. So he started rereading them with adult eyes, whatever he read in infancy and adolescence, because he looked at them with innocence then. So now he just clarifies his stand. He says, don't ever mistake me to be a sad and a disillusioned man who's battered and bruised because I had to go through many disguises through different avenues of literature that was created by different dubious practitioners. So don't mistake that I went through so many things, and so I have a very sickening perception. He says, no, but I am a man with abiding faith in what? In the profession of writing, in the profession of literature. Because the careful and cautious mode of reading is what I advocate. So whenever you read. Let anybody write anything, but it's your reading that matters a lot. So when you read it carefully, read it cautiously, because that mode of reading is what he advocates. And therefore he says it's not a signal of despair, but it's the strongest vote of confidence. So he's saying, I'm not saying, oh, writings are so bad, and so I'm giving you a forewarning or a warning. No, it's not a signal of despair. But he says it's a vote of confidence that can be given to the writers and their work. So this is what Chinua Achebe says. I hope you understand whatever has been discussed so far, and you really appreciate what's there. So thank you for your patient watching. Thank you.